Hello there, my dear friend on the internet. I am not an expert, I'm just a nerd, but I'm here to be a nerd with you as we dive into the wonderful world of our history. So let's get started. The year is 1827 AD, and we find ourselves in the modern day Canadian province of Newfoundland and Labrador, although just on the island part of Newfoundland, and that's where most of our story today actually will take place. And even though we're beginning on the very center part of the island, far away from the coast, we're still starting out by water. And that is because here and now, in November, I should say, of 1827, we are standing by the shores of a lake known today as Beothuk Lake. And by the shores of that lake, we would find a man named William Cormack. Cormack was Scottish by birth, but by this point, he had already spent some time in Newfoundland. Like many men of his age, he fancied himself as something of a naturalist and explorer, though he had a better claim to that title than most. He had studied at the universities of Glasgow and Edinburgh, and by 1827 had already taken part in several expeditions across Newfoundland, and claimed the title of being the first white man to cross the island on foot, with the help of a local native guide, of course. Though this current expedition that we join him on is not one for scientific gain or glory, and the preceding days leading up to this, before he'd gotten to the lake, had taken a tone of almost frantic desperation. William Cormack was on a quest, and it was a quest that would deeply consume and depress him. Cormack had become passionately interested in the local Aboriginal tribe of Newfoundland, known to him as the Beothuk. He had spoken with a member of the Beothuk community recently, a young woman, and he had heard from her and from others that their people were in trouble. Cormack, as well as many other British settlers in Newfoundland, had even heard whispers of an insidious plot, with the French teaming up with another Aboriginal tribe known as the Mi'kmaq to take the Beothuk out. Cormack and many other British settlers to Newfoundland were horrified at this idea, and so Cormack had put together this expedition to go out into the wilderness to locate what Beothuk were left and to see if he could help, if they could help in any way. By the time Cormack had reached the province's interior and had gotten as far as Beothuk Lake, he had already been on foot for several days, and they had encountered evidence of the Beothuk, old mammotiques, or the beautiful living structures that they built, and some other things, including the fascinating remains of what looked like a particularly grand birch bark canoe. But all this stuff was old, and it looked like it belonged in a Beothuk ghost town. But through all this, the lake had been Cormack's great hope. The lake, Beothuk Lake, it was named after them after all. This was their place. If he could just get here, and if he could just convince whoever remained of his good intentions, maybe they could finally figure out what was going on. But now, as we join William Cormack on the edges of Beothuk Lake in the middle of November in thick snow and cold, we find William Cormack in a state of misery. Yes, there were more mammotiques at the lake. There were the remains of smoking buildings to preserve their meats and other things, but no Beothuk. As Cormack explored further, and with almost a feverish tone now, he discovered the remains of an old cemetery even. But there were still no living people here, many graves, and eventually he came upon a raised sepulchre that the Beothuk had erected, and inside he encountered something particularly heartbreaking. There were the remains of several children, as well as an adult man and woman, what would later be identified as a married couple. All had been arranged with great care and with different items put around them as offerings and gifts. The woman in particular had been shown great love as well, placed in a pine coffin and wrapped in white muslin. And there's a chance that Cormack may have known this woman, or at least may have known of her. He'd recently met her niece, actually. And Cormack, though not a perfect man, I think truly did care about the Beothuk. And I think he meant well. He meant well to trudge through the snow to get there. He meant well, I'm sure, as he stared down at the bodies of this wonderful family. And I think, in his way, he meant well too, as he then reached down and removed the heads of the adult couple. And after carefully looking them over, tucked them in his bag to later send back to Scotland to his favorite professor. Cormack would then continue his trek back down to the city of St. John's, going through the Exploits Valley and looking still for any signs of living Beothuk. And they found the remains of old caribou fences and things, but no people. Nowhere. And I wonder if at any point on that journey back to the city, if it occurred to Cormac that those people, those beautiful Beothuk people that he saw resting in peace by the shores of that lake, were the last Beothuk he would ever see in the wilds of Newfoundland. And as clever as he was and experienced as he was, I have to really ask myself if he knew that it wasn't that they were hiding from him. It wasn't even that the French and the Mi'kmaq had teamed up to take them out, or even just that their population numbers were low. If deep down he knew that it wasn't that the Beothuk were just getting hard to find. It's that the Beothuk, for all intents and purposes, were gone. Hello, my name is Marie, and welcome to Lost Realms. Each episode we look at a different city, place, or people that have been lost to us, whether through the destruction of a disaster, the ravages of climatic changes, the failure of governments, or the cruelty of neighbors. These places and people were taken from us forever. Some we can still visit in one form or another today, though some never again. Some would have held the very best and brightest of humanity, and some could have been considered part of the origin story of monsters. But all of them, regardless of their moral alignment, remain part of our collective human history, and all of them we attempt with love and understanding to get to know here. Tonight we're going to explore the mystery of the vanishing of the Beothuk people of Newfoundland and Labrador, Canada. The Beothuk were possibly the first ever Native Americans to come into contact with Europeans. They are also just a fascinating and beautiful culture in their own right. We're going to explore the lives that they lived and the world that they lived in before contact with Europeans. We're going to look at how that eventual contact changed their lives and how their disappearance, as we know it, is tragic, but not necessarily as concrete or set in stone as some may think that it is. But the Beothuk, like any culture, did not exist or occur in a vacuum. So if we truly want to get to know them to the best of our ability, then we have to start with the story of the land that made them. The geography of Newfoundland and Labrador is truly stunning, though again, for the purposes of our story, we'll just focus on the island portion of Newfoundland. If you look at this image that I'm showing you here on the screen now, you can see that the island is dominated on the west coast by the long-range mountain chain, which is beautiful and distinctive for its tabletop peaks. These mountains slowly give way as we go east and stretch down into hills and valleys, sometimes giving way into bogs and swamps, but often there's forest throughout, until we get to the coast, which in itself is beautifully marked with fjords and inlets, and there's a huge amount of tiny islands all around Newfoundland, almost like asteroids around the star. And of course, such beautiful and majestic scenery means some beautiful and majestic wildlife. Newfoundland, despite being cut off from the mainland, is home to a large variety of animal life, including its own subspecies of lynx, as well as caribou, beaver, fox, Arctic hare, and many others. There's also some beautiful vegetation here, and of course we haven't even discussed the sea life yet, or birds. There's an amazing variety of maritime fowl and many other creatures here. It's quite breathtaking. And with the rich natural resources here, human beings first came to our island around 4,500 years ago. And by only around 500 years after that, they had completely settled the coast of the island. These early inhabitants are known today as the Maritime Archaic people, and they get the maritime part of their name from the fact that we have recovered so many different fishing and marine hunting tools from their archaeological sites. And you can see here from some of the images I'm showing you just how beautiful and complex some of their tools and equipment were. They also produced amazing cultural and spiritual artifacts, pendants and ornaments, some bearing the images of animals, birds, and even people, and they worked artistically with many of the amazing natural resources available to them, like bone, antler, wood, stone, as well as crystals like quartz, calcite, and amethyst. Some of these masterpieces are still absolutely breathtaking even today. And at the gravesite of Fort Chai, we can see some of this amazing artistic work in incredible detail. It's worth noting, too, that the Maritime Archaic people constructed the oldest known burial mound anywhere in the New World. It was found full of ornaments and pendants and many offerings and gifts, and the remains were also covered with red ochre, an early use of the pigment by the native inhabitants here. This grave, despite its riches and profound age, didn't seem to contain the remains of a king or chieftain either, but instead, when excavated, revealed the remains of a 12-year-old child. And while the spiritual beliefs of these people are still a relative mystery to us, they clearly had an amazing and highly developed culture, which is part of what makes what occurred next to them so upsetting and such a shock. See, the maritime archaic people were not just successful on Newfoundland. They had been incredibly successful in Labrador as well, and in fact this culture had spread a vast distance. But by around 4,000 years ago, things would begin to change, at least on the mainland. A new group referred to archaeologists today as the Paleo-Eskimos had come in, and slowly we see the maritime archaic people begin to disappear. We don't know exactly what happened to them, if it was related to these Paleo-Eskimos at all, or other changes happened, but by around 3,500 years ago, the maritime archaic people would disappear everywhere, except on Newfoundland. And even here on Newfoundland, their population seems to have decreased drastically, and we don't really know why. But almost all evidence of them, except for a little bit found near the Strait of Belle Isle on the northern part of the island, just completely vanishes. Many historians now feel that our maritime archaic people, somewhat protected and sheltered on our island, would eventually grow and evolve to become the peoples known to us today as the Beaches and later Little Passage people. Both of these names of Beaches and Little Passage come from the names of archaeological sites found for their respective cultures. The names are kind of arbitrary otherwise. We're looking through some very mysterious history where we still need to learn a lot more. But we're also looking at definitely something of a chain. We see, for example, quite a few similarities between the Little Passage people and the Beaches people before them, and then going back gradually to the maritime archaic people. These cultures, as time went by, would have changed and grown and adapted. And as we move through time and come forward a little bit until we find ourselves at 500 to 1000 AD, we start to see now mainly the Little Passage people on Newfoundland, who, though still very mysterious to us like so much else, have left us some amazing and intriguing artifacts, and if I may say, seem to have been just as sophisticated as their predecessors had been. Which is a great thing, because now, as we get to the dawn of that new millennium, we see that change is coming yet again to the island of Newfoundland, in a very unexpected form. New visitors would now come to the shores of our island, and these new visitors and settlers would have a profound impact not just on the Beothuk, but on every single Aboriginal culture in North America. And these people were, of course, the Europeans. When we think of Europeans colonizing the New World, I think we tend to think of Columbus and Hispaniola and of like a big thunderclap thing that shakes everything. But in fact, the European colonization of North America took place a little differently and was kind of in fits and starts and wasn't always by the same people. The first Europeans that we know of to arrive in North America were Vikings in around 1000 AD, though it could have been a little earlier. These Vikings reported seeing Skraelings, their word and a quite offensive one, for the native inhabitants of North America. And it's kind of impossible to tell from their records if they encountered our Beothuk or another tribe, though ours or the Inuit seem most likely. And while the Vikings were never able to maintain a permanent settlement in the New World, they did build some, and they would go back with stories of these people. And a few hundred years later, in the late 1400s and going forward, new settlers, especially British settlers, would start to arrive on the coast of Newfoundland. And at first, their contact with the local inhabitants here seems to have been minimal. As I said, the Little Passage people had been living in Newfoundland for some time. And it's here that I have to address something of an elephant in the room, because you've not heard me mention the Beothuk yet at all since our introduction. But that is because the Little Passage people are the Beothuk. In fact, academically, among historians, the only difference between the Little Passage people and the Beothuk is that one has come into contact with Europeans and one has not. And now with the arrival of the Europeans, our Little Passage people could be properly considered to be Beothuk. The word Beothuk comes from their language, meaning just people or true people. And as you see now, we're the result of thousands of years of earlier history. The Beothuk, when the Europeans first arrived on the shores of Newfoundland, seemed to have just wisely kind of kept to themselves and tried to distance themselves from these dangerous newcomers. And these newcomers were unfortunately quite dangerous. Slavery of the native inhabitants of the New World was, of course, the norm at the start, and later as settlers took to the coast of Newfoundland and began to live full-time as fishermen and trappers, this created many problems for the Beothuk. The coastline of the island had always been their main home. Most of their food was marine-based. But now, with all these Europeans nearby, these dangerous Europeans, the Beothuk would have to move inward, move away from the coast where most of the British settlers had made their home. But that creates a whole new host of problems, because by now many of those new settlers, they were really into the fur trade. A quick glance at any history textbook will tell you that the fur trade in the early days of the colonization of the New World was such a big deal. Those European aristocrats loved their furs. There seemed to be an almost inexhaustible supply of them and the creatures that bore them here across the water. Now, in many of the other British-occupied territories in North America, the settlers would just pay the native tribes to hunt for them and buy the furs from them and kind of save themselves that annoying step. But the Beothuk were so wary of the Europeans that just wasn't going to work. So the Europeans started going out into the woods themselves and setting traps. Meanwhile, European fishermen all along the coast were getting about the business of being fishermen and throwing down nets and everything else. And the Beothuk now, they couldn't hunt on the coast. They have to avoid the trappers in the mainland. And so now they're just getting into this tighter and tighter area, and they're just getting desperate now. Like, yes, they'd hunted beaver and caribou before in the past, but it was always kind of an occasional thing. Especially caribou, those can be dangerous and a lot of work to hunt. And so, in desperation, the Beothuk started stealing bits of metal from fishermen's traps and from the fur traps they were finding now all throughout their woods, just to try to get some sort of leg up, not even to make weapons against the Europeans, just to help them hunt food, just to get food. But then, of course, the Europeans were not so happy about that either. The British settlers of Newfoundland started to complain about the thievery of the Beothuk and their desperation and sneaky ways, and pretty soon, violence would erupt on the island of Newfoundland. It started as attacks here or there, but over time seemed to become almost more organized. Beothuk being murdered, children and women being captured and sold into slavery or as servants. It seems to have been mostly the work of trappers and fishermen, though some did try to stop this, it appears. There were several reports from naval captains who witnessed atrocities being committed against the Beothuk people that issued reports. It's just there wasn't either a lot done or the actions taken were ineffective. One of the governors at the time put out laws against mistreatment of the Beothuk and even offered a reward for people who helped establish peaceful relations with them. But by now, there was a group of the local settler population who really didn't like the Beothuk. Several massacres were carried out by the same people, one in particular known as John Peyton Sr., who, along with his son, John Peyton Jr., took part in several raids against the Beothuk people, ostensibly to recover stolen fishing equipment, but would often devolve into brutal violence. And I think it's worth mentioning here that due to the nature of Newfoundland just being an island, and due partly, I think, to the population decrease of the Maritime Archaic those couple thousand years ago, by the time Europeans arrived at Newfoundland, the population numbers of the Beothuk were only around 500 to 1,000. Like pre-contact, there was only between 500 and 1,000 Beothuk living on Newfoundland already when the Europeans arrived. And now, all this. And so now, as we set the stage for the last part of our story of the Beothuk, we are left with the image of a people with an incredible history and an incredible resilience and an incredible will to survive, fighting against overwhelming odds. And soon, the pain that the Beothuk were going through would start to become very noticeable. The Beothuk people had become famous by the 1800s for one trait in particular, and that was their use of red ochre to cover their faces and at times their bodies, and give them a red cast to their skin. It's believed that this is where the term, quote, Red Indian, end quote, comes from. Though not all the First Nations did this, the Beothuk were a fascinating people. But also at the start of the 1800s, they had been reduced to very much what's been called a refugee population, forced now just to mainly the interior of the island. They were living mostly in an area called Exploit Valley, primarily living along the Exploits River. This river, at its furthest most reaches through its tributaries, flows into our familiar Lake Beothuk. And in fact, around this time, the people would have been living around that lake quite often. Still the subject of encroachment and at times outright murder or capture, this combined with the deadly toll of European diseases like tuberculosis had left them harrowed. And now stuck as they were in this lake, in this valley, they were still trying to do the best they could. And we see here some of the ingenious tools they've made from the scavenged metal that I told you about before. Meanwhile, there wasn't really anywhere they could flee to either. Towards the west and the north, there were the Mi'kmaq and the French, who also served as competition for resources. There really was just nowhere else for them to go. In 1818, a group of desperate Beothuk looking for the metal that we've been talking about pilfered a salmon boat along with its equipment and tools from one John Peyton Jr. Jr. would apply for and receive permission from the Newfoundland governor to launch an expedition to retrieve his fishing equipment, but was given extremely specific instructions to not be violent in any way, and also to use this, if possible, as a way to build friendly relations with the Beothuk people. The governor and his people at this point had noticed that the numbers of the Beothuk had been decreasing. There had been stories of them showing up emaciated and starved, looking for help even sometimes from settlers. And this had left some people actually feeling quite concerned. If you didn't have your fur traps or your fishing gear stolen from you, if you didn't really have a problem with these guys, then you just kind of felt bad for them. And so this wasn't actually even the first time that the government had made an attempt to establish friendly relations with the Beothuk. There had even been a couple instances of a successful silent barter where the Beothuk would put out their goods and then just leave and back off. And the settlers could come forward and put down what they thought was fair in exchange for what they wanted. There had been hope then, maybe, of some friendly relations, but the fishermen and trappers, who did understandably feel wronged, their choice to respond with violence had, of course, left the Beothuk extremely wary of any European people, and so relations had been souring. They really had. The Beothuk found themselves just isolated in the middle of the island. So, when the Beothuk had taken this salmon boat and its equipment, the government said, okay, you can go for it, but you have to try to do this politely, and you can get back your equipment, but nothing else, and just try to establish some friendly relations with these people. Peyton Jr., you'll remember, is the son of Peyton Sr., who had participated in a massacre of the Beothuk people not long before, and was particularly known for his brutal treatment of them. As we'll see, Peyton Jr. may have had a few things in common with his father. He and a party of men that included his father would find and locate the Beothuk and recover their equipment. They also recovered a young Beothuk woman who just wasn't fast enough to escape them. And they grabbed her and they yanked her back to them, and she was pleading with them. She was a mother. She was a nursing mother, as a matter of fact, and she even showed her nursing breast to them, like, please, please, please. They didn't care about that. Somehow, mission objectives had changed. This beautiful young woman named Damastuit would be taken away from her family and from her child, and when her husband, who happened to be the chief of the Beothuk at that time, a man named Nanaspasut, tried to come to her rescue, he was shot down for his efforts. Damastuit's child would pass away a few days later, and she herself would be taken to St. John's, where, when in St. John's, they changed her name to Mary March, March from the name of the month that they caught her in. Damastuit would become something of a celebrity in St. John's, and was welcomed as a frequent visitor to the governor at his residence, where his wife, Lady Hamilton, painted a beautiful portrait of her that you're seeing here. She would remain in St. John's for some time in the care of a missionary named John Lay, and he seems to have gone out of his way to learn about the Beothuk from her, eventually developing a vocabulary of Beothuk words from what she taught him. And soon there became a growing feeling that Mary, or more properly, Damastuit, shouldn't be kept here. She should be allowed to return home. And so they tried. They actually tried several times to return her to her family, but they couldn't find anyone. In the winter of 1820, they tried a final time, but Damastuit would unfortunately pass away from most likely tuberculosis on the voyage. David Buchan, the naval officer in charge of her voyage, and who had actually known her for some time, was quite upset over this, and he brought her body safely to the shores of Beothuk Lake and left it there carefully placed with gifts for the Beothuk people, in a way of showing their sorrow and I think of trying to return her remains respectfully. This act would be witnessed by several of her family members who were actually hiding from the Europeans and watching what was going on. As they returned the body of Damastuit to the shores of the lake, her family would retrieve the body and gifts and inter Damastuit in a raised sepulchre with her husband's remains as well, and that of her child. By this point, the family putting her in the sepulchre would have been very, very few in number, and their chief was now dead. And by 1823, that number would become even smaller. 3 women, a mother, and her 2 daughters would emerge from the forest, starving and sick, seeking help. They were taken by a fur trader to St. John's, where the mother and one of the daughters died. The last remaining daughter, a young woman named Shauna Didit, quickly had her name changed to Nancy April and was taken into the household of John Peyton Jr., who seemed very protective of her. However, by this point, the government, as well as a young man named William Cormack, insisted that she be taken into the care of William Cormack, as well as an institute that he had founded known as the Beothuk Institute. Cormack would interview her at length, and we learn a tremendous amount from her about the Beothuk people, though those who knew her described her as a very serious and sad woman who never laughed or smiled. She admitted at one point that she felt the numbers of her people were less than 20, and she drew many beautiful pictures of them and their lifestyle and ways, some of which you're seeing now. The Beothuk in general were a branch of the Algonquin people, people that the modern-day Mi'kmaq and Innu are a part of. In fact, the modern-day language of the Innu is thought to be extremely similar to that of the Beothuk. And Beothuk culture seems beautiful, and much of what we know of them comes from the words of Damastuit and Shauna Didit. She would eventually succumb to tuberculosis in June of 1829. And was the last known living Beothuk person of any kind. By 1829, Cormac had already visited that raised sepulchre and paid his respects and taken those bones and sent them back to Scotland. Cormac would spend several years trying to raise interest and funds towards hunting down whatever remained of the Beothuk population, but he eventually gave up hope and heart and would give up on the project completely and spend most of the rest of his life devoted to other pursuits. And Shauna Didit's skull would also end up being shipped across the water. It was enclosed in a tin case with a sign that read, quote, "The skull and sculp of Nancy, Beothuk Red Indian female," and was displayed at the Royal College of Physicians in London, along with a list of answers to 16 questions about her. The skull is believed to have been lost during the Second World War. The skulls of Damastuit and her husband, though, would remain in Scotland and on display at the National Museum of Scotland for many, many years. Meanwhile, the rumors of the French and the Mi'kmaq teaming up to take out the Beothuk, they were proved to not be true. It turns out, meanwhile, the French were also telling people, hey, you need to just be nicer. The Mi'kmaq have long claimed that the Beothuk never disappeared at all, actually. And to be honest, I am inclined to believe this. Recent DNA evidence shows they are related. And the Mi'kmaq have long claimed that near the end, as the Beothuk were struggling, the Mi'kmaq welcomed them and helped them as they could. They became one with the Mi'kmaq, intermarrying with them and becoming part of their people. And while the Europeans would go on to tell the tales of the Beothuk being hunted down and of them being an extinct and vanished people, from the point of view of the Mi'kmaq and the Innu, the Beothuk just evolved and became one with their own people and part of their family. In 2015, Chief Miseljo of the Miapukak First Nation began the process of trying to repatriate the skulls, the remains of Damastuit and her husband. He had to fight hard for this, and Joe even traveled to Scotland himself to view the remains and perform a sweetgrass ritual over them to cleanse negative energies and spirits. By 2016, the Premier of Newfoundland and Labrador, a man named Dwight Ball, sent a letter to the National Museum of Scotland asking them to send the remains of the Beothuk couple home. This was followed by another request in November of 2017 from the Federal Minister of Canadian Heritage, Melanie Joy. But again, nothing, and in fact it would take years of lobbying to get their family members brought back home. It wouldn't be until 2019 that the director of the National Museum of Scotland would agree to start working out a process to send home the remains. And finally, in 2020, after years of hard work and heartache, the remains of Damastuit and Nonosabuset were brought back home. This was a beautiful and emotional experience for many, many people on the island, and I think around the world. And for now, the remains of our couple are being housed at a museum, but it's one in Newfoundland, and this is just temporary. And as I record this, they are working at constructing a heritage memorial and site to house the remains in a respectful fashion, and as a place people can come to learn about Beothuk culture and history. This center will be at Beothuk Lake, the place where we began our story, and the place where once, a long time ago, the remains were taken from their home and their bodies by a man who meant very, very well, I'm sure. And I'm sure most of the players of our story meant very, very well, but who in the end still did very, very wrong. And we're still left trying to get to know these people through remains and heritage centers. But at least now, these remains are back home and are starting to be treated with the respect that they deserve, as is the heritage of the Beothuk people, who, as you now know, are not really gone, not really. And certainly the modern-day Mi'kmaq people and Innu are very, very proud of their heritage and connection to the Beothuk Nation. Today you can find a vast variety of information online and different museums where the history of this wonderful people is shared, at least as much as we know it. And today the Beothuk people and their history are finally starting to be viewed as the integral part of the world's history that they deserve to be. Well, that's just about my favorite thing when that happens. And that's the end of our story and the end of my time here with you tonight. Thank you so much for being here with me for the story of the Beothuk and their people. Whenever we go into our history, we can see or hear things that upset us or confuse us or even make us angry. But if we feel anything about our history at all, then I think that means that it matters to us. And I think that that's beautiful. So if you have anything you'd like to share about today's episode, please don't be afraid to drop down in the comments below, or you can find my links for Instagram as well as Reddit in the description box. And if you're truly interested in the history of the Beothuk people, please don't let my words be the only words you hear on the topic. You'll find a full source list for today's episode in the top comment below. And looking at that source list while at the library would be even more fun. I also have sleepy time versions of all these main episodes available on my channel, as well as I'm running a small companion series called Lost Bits, where I share bits of information that don't fit into these main episodes and also answer your questions. So if that sounds like your thing, please check it out. Please also consider subscribing so you don't miss anything. But either way, thank you so much for being here. Not just for your views, but for your interest in history, for your compassion, your empathy, and your humanity, which is genuinely what I think an interest in history is. Thank you for being these things. And now, until next time, be safe, be happy, go with all my love. Good night.